been wanting to do this for a really long time because I loved reading a book, this one, History of Desiring in Terms, a brilliant book. And there are a lot of traits that I want to pick up. I really don't know where to start. But just to give an introduction to the audience, you are Professor Madhavi Menon, a professor of English at Ashoka University, and you've done excellent work, particularly on desire, sexuality, queer history, and related topics. So, before we get into this book, I wanted to ask you something about interpretation in general. So, I think one of the claims that is implicit in your work on Shakespeare is that every movement, every age has a certain interpretation of the text. The Reformist age has an interpretation, the Renaissance has an interpretation, the Enlightenment age has an interpretation. So there ought to be a queer interpretation of Shakespeare as well. But I'm also wondering if it is possible for the text to be divorced from its context entirely, because what one desires changes from time to time, and what is acceptable for one to desire also changes from time to time. So, like Derrida said, that you cannot separate the work from the biography of the author. So, do you think that it is really possible to interpret a text in isolation purely on the basis of the context that we live in instead of the context that the author lived in?
I'm not sure Derrida ever said that you've got to take the biography of the author in mind in order to interpret a text. Certainly a certain degree of context one has to keep in mind, but I don't think a context ever fully explains a text. If it did, then every book written in a particular period would sound the same. And it doesn't, because people have different approaches to it and different takes on it. So I'm not a big fan of sort of totally contextualized readings, and certainly biographical readings, not at all. Context certainly makes a difference in as much as, for instance, if you know that a book is written in the midst of a war, then somehow that sort of becomes interesting to know, even though the book might not necessarily be referring to that. But other than that, as I said, I don't think there's any exhaustive way one can say a book was written in this moment in time, therefore it sounds like this. I think that therefore is very suspect and suspicious and extremely flattening. It sort of seems to suggest a one size fits all, which certainly is not the case with literature. And I'm also not quite sure if different ages have a different interpretation of, say, Shakespeare, because that's what you asked about. Certainly different epochs or literary movements seem to read Shakespeare with slightly different emphases from other movements, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily reading it completely opposed to one another. So, for instance, how we read Shakespeare today might be very similar to, say, how the 18th century read him, but the sort of valorizations and emphases might be different. And so when Samuel Taylor Coleridge says Shakespeare's investment in wordplay, his investment in the pun, was so severe that the pun was to him like the fatal Cleopatra that led him astray, then we too might be able to sort of notice the pun and see the pun, but we might not think of it as a fatal Cleopatra. We might actually think of it as something utterly enabling and fertile and fecund. So it's not that we are sort of not that everybody's seeing different things, but that the emphasis might fall differently, perhaps, depending on when you're reading it.
Right. So I think that, of course, there are different contradictory texts written in the same period, but at the same time, that's why you need to take the author's opinion, the author's biography into account instead of just the context. I don't think, for instance, that it's possible to read the Bible without the context in which it was written. So
what biography would you keep in mind to read the Bible?
Not the biography, but the context in which it was written. So I recently wrote an article on the historical Jesus, and it was hard to separate the context. If you need to find the historical Jesus in the Bible, it's very hard to separate the context from the text itself. So to read the text in isolation would be a completely religious way of reading it. But if you really want to find a sort of objective view, then you need to take into account the times that Jesus lived in, the language.
We just have to agree to disagree on that. I absolutely don't subscribe to that. The Bible itself, as you know, was written over several decades.
Yeah.
So you can't, in fact, say here is this historical moment that is responsible for the writing of the Bible. It was sort of several moments and several rewritings and several suppressed writings and several books that were thrown out and several texts that were considered apocryphal and not part of the Bible. So no, I'm not a fan of including biography, not at all, and context only to a very limited extent.
Right. So yeah, right. So we can get into the your book on desire. So how do you differentiate? Because I know that you're not a fan of categorization at all, but there seems to be a certain overlap between desire and love and sex. So do you think that desire serves as a sort of middle ground between love and sex, even though it's not possible to completely define desire, as it were? But
sorry, Anwesh, you froze for a little in the middle. I lost you when you said, do I think desire serves as a
middle ground to love and sex?
Oh, you're frozen again.
Am I clear now?
Yeah. Does desire serve as a
middle ground to between love and sex?
Right. I mean, I'm not sure one can fully separate any of these categories from one another. In many ways, to the layperson and to any of us just thinking about it on an everyday basis, these words can pretty much be used synonymously with one another, and often are. The reason I picked the term desire, or the reason that I like the term desire, is that it's much harder to slot it or pigeonhole it into either a sort of sentimental register, which is where love is immediately drawn in. The idea of love becomes an extremely sentimentalized notion of what happens between two people. And it's also difficult to slot it immediately into a register of physicality or sort of genital intercourse, which is how sex usually gets slotted. And desire, as I think I sort of make clear in the book, is always something that exceeds all these categories, exceeds all these categorizations, precisely because it can never be exhausted by them. So, famously across texts, across different centuries, insist on the fact that genital intercourse does not exhaust desire, that you still have desire despite having intercourse. Similarly, you still have desire after sort of experiencing love or falling in love or whatever it is. So love and sex seem to sort of name more graspable versions of what desire is. And desire really becomes a fairly complex, complicated, difficult to grasp concept that sort of includes all these things, but is not reducible to any of them.
But desire seems to use the language of both love and sex to describe, especially in the case of, as you wrote about the Sufis, which was very surprising to me, first of all, because I did not know about the Jamali Kamali Tom. I did not know about Sheikh Madhav Hussain, which is, it's such a poignant story that and such a relevant story to our contemporary times, a Muslim peer being with a Brahmin boy, and both of them being is describing their relationship in a form of homoeroticism. So that will be, in our times, it's definitely going to be scandalous, but because we live in a land of contradiction, we seem to have no problem commemorating them and celebrating their love for each other and singing their poems. So why do you think that the language of sexuality in general is sort of so helpful in describing a sort of religious or spiritual affiliation, not just in the case of India, but also in case of, for instance, the Saint sculpture of Saint Teresa, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. I don't think that you can separate the sexual element of that sculpture at all. So why is the language of sexuality so seem to feature so much in the religious experience?
Yeah, I think both sexuality and religion, which is why the Sufis, which is something the Sufis made great use of, as did the Bhakti poets, for instance, and certainly a certain mode of medieval European poetry as well. There is a great sympathy between both fields of something that both is and is not physical, that both is and is not material. So going back to the question that you just asked before, what is the relationship between desire and love, or desire and sex? Religion, like desire, is both something that you can see all around you. You can see temples, you can see mosques, you can see churches, you can see people wearing, a different religiously coded wear or clothes or accoutrement. But at the same time, it is gesturing towards something that you can't see. It's gesturing towards something that's utterly ineffable, that's something that you cannot, in fact, pin down or recognize in a material realm. Now, similarly, desire fulfills those two categories, which is why the Sufis will always sing to their earthly lover, their human lover, but always indicating also a lover beyond, a lover in the spiritual realm. And it's very easy to map the one onto the other, because sexuality, like religiosity, both fits and does not fit the categories that we have in place for them. And because of that, and I think these are the only two things that might fall in that category, because of that, they have always over time made a very interesting layering with one another.
Well, it's interesting because I think that one of the differences that the Western view and the sort of Indian view of sexuality seems to be the categorization, which is to say that the Western view seems to be that everything has a category and you cannot go beyond this category. The debate of the same-sex marriage, for instance, that I was born gay and I cannot change, and so I deserve these rights. So that seems to be one of the central arguments. On the other hand, the Indian view, as you describe in your book, seems to not have a name, a particular name for the design. It's much more flexible. So that is completely understandable to me. But what I really fail to understand is your idea that what I can't reconcile is your idea that the LGBT identity, because I think one of your arguments seems to be that it's first a Western construct and does not map well onto the Indian landscape. And I think that's a perfectly valid argument. But given that, how do you think it's possible to organize for our rights without a particular categorization?
Yeah. How did the Sufis do it? or how did Vatsyayana do it in the Kama Sutra, or how did anybody do it in centuries past? And I think the reason why um, I am not a fan of the umbrella term LGBTQIA plus, which doesn't mean I don't think people should use it if they want to. Of course, people should feel free to do what they want, so long as they're not harming anybody else. I'm not a fan of its use just because I find it too amnesiac. I find it too sort of historically present in this moment. So, in the US, these are the labels they're using, therefore we will also use these labels. And I find it very, very exclusionary. And you see, the irony of a term like LGBTQIA plus is at one and the same time the understanding that in fact alphabets cannot capture identity, or categories cannot capture identity, which is why you have a proliferation of them, right? Have plus at the end, because there's so many more to come. So on the one hand, there is that understanding. And on the other hand, there is a forgetting of that understanding. And you say, no, I don't care. I'm going to have a label in any case. And so for me, because I am an academic and a scholar, for me, what's interesting is that moment of forgetting. When you sort of say, I don't care about this potential contradiction, I'm going to pretend like it doesn't exist. And for me, that contradiction is what is important and what is interesting and what needs to be put pressure on. Now, if we think of organization, or if we think of activism as being activism of and for and by separate entities, then you're absolutely right that you need some kind of banner under which to march. And the more exclusionary that banner, the better it might be. If we just shift our understanding of organization a little bit, to thinking less about how do we get rights for one community, and say, how do we guarantee rights, period, for everyone, then you'll find the need less for exclusionary categories, and your umbrellas will start looking different. So for instance, rather than having an umbrella saying LGBTQI plus A or A plus, you might have an umbrella that says, as Marx did, workers of the world unite, right? And there is something extremely utopian, no doubt, but to me, extremely appealing of that kind of non-denominational solidarity. And that non-denominational solidarity is important, especially in a country like India, which is so riven on the basis of these categories. So I think adding to those categories doesn't actually help us, but trying to find an alternative way of living, being, and thinking is what is the need of the hour.
This also ties in with your, piece on same-sex marriage, where you essentially argued that, why demand the right to marry at all? Why not ask the state to not recognize any marriage at all? Which is not to say that you cannot marry, you can marry, but the state will not recognize, because every time the state recognizes. But of course, the opposition to that is that marriage is recognized by the state and is linked with various other rights, adoption rights, immigration rights, and things like that. Having said that, it is possible for one to demand those rights without demanding marriage rights at all. Say, we want those rights, you don't recognize marriage, and you give us those rights. So that is a fair argument, but I think that it's much harder because we live in a very relatively closed society where marriage is already recognized by the state. And it's harder to demand the de-recognition of marriage completely than it is to demand the right of same-sex couples to marry. So it's much easier strategically, at least, to ask the state to recognize the right of gay people to marry rather than, ask them to not recognize marriage, which is farther away. I think that in 5 years, it's possible that we'll see that it's possible for us to see same-sex marriage, but in 5 years, it's not possible for us to see a complete recognition of marriage.
I guess I am never a fan of easy solutions. And I guess I'm never a fan of the easy way out, which has got me into trouble at many, many moments. Easy for whom? Easy in what way are always questions we have to ask. If it's easy in the sense that it will get you the quick fix that you think you need, maybe. But that quick fix is coming at what cost and at what price? To my mind, it's at too high a cost and too high a price. Because what you're essentially saying is you're acquiescing to the state's control over your desire and saying, we will allow you to tie your civil rights to who I have sex with. And I find that actually absolutely astonishing that anyone would want to do that. So it's not, one shouldn't, the question is not, should we ask the state to recognize or not recognize marriage? The question is, do we dissociate civil rights from marriage altogether? And that is the battle we need to be fighting. Because the minute you say, okay, fine, same-sex, let's allow same-sex marriages, then what you're basically doing is washing a certain kind of oppositional sexual orientation, washing away all the oppositionality from it. And basically what you're saying is, look, we too want exactly the same things that you do. Why won't you allow us to be like you? And I find that a waste of the political capital, a waste of the intellectual capital that I actually think non-heteronormative sexualities have the power of reproducing.
Well, that's very interesting argument to make. And I agree with your critique of identity politics, because I'm not a fan of identity politics either. I'm not a fan of categorization. But all of these objections, whenever I talk with people of that group, these objections always sort of come up, like, we have been denied rights for too long and we want it now. And there's a certain impatience, and that impatience is understandable. But of course, the ideal way out would be the libertarian approach. But I don't think we have any state which actually, right now, which actually completely derecognizes marriage. So, for India to follow it will be, while it will be in line with its past, its history, it's also at the same time a much harder battle to fight. But if there were to be an organization like that, I would definitely join hands. Okay, so you have argued, and this is a question that one of my friend Anirudh had for you, and he is also a fan of your book, that in a book on dating, you mentioned that Ram is a politically correct establishment kind of god. So why do you think Ram is this establishment kind of god as opposed to the other 33,000 gods that we have? Like, it's not possible that we don't have any other establishment gods. So what is it about Ram that sort of captures people as this, archetypal hero figure?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I can answer that question from a general perspective. I can address that question from the perspective of desire. And if you're thinking about from the perspective of desire and also the perspective of gender, it seems very clear that of all the big gods and goddesses in the pantheon, Ram fits a certain kind of bill in terms of both gender and sexuality. He's always described as being the sort of paterfamilias. He's the sort of older brother of Lakshman, the husband of Sita. All the iconography always shows him presiding over Lakshman and Sita and Hanuman as well. So there's a certain kind of gendered arrogation of authority and power that gets concentrated in the figure of Ram. And then, of course, when you add to that the stories about his suspicions around Sita's chastity, the banishment of Sita, and then Sita's, of course, self-annihilation, because Rama would rather listen to some men who wonder about her sexuality than listen to his wife. All that sort of gendered male suspicion of female sexuality is something that caters very well to a certain North Indian misogynistic, macho masculine mindset. And so Ram is much bigger from the perspective of gender and sexuality in North India than other gods are. And of course, this is not true in other parts of the country, which luckily are slightly less macho and slightly less misogynistic. But that is my reading of it, and that's what I've written about in the book as well.
So I think that one of the points that you argue is that the state that we're in, we partially owe it to the British, because it was the British who, when they were making the laws, the book that they referred to was Manusmriti and not the other hundreds of other progressive books that India has. So, like, is it like, were they looking at Manusmriti because it was a projection of their beliefs, because it agreed with their point of view? Or was it because it was popular enough or acceptable enough for the general population?
Yeah, I'm sure a bit of both, but perhaps more skewed towards the first one, which is that the Manusmriti is an obnoxious piece of work. And it's an obnoxious piece of work precisely because it takes as fundamental the caste division to everything in the world. So everything in the world is looked at through the lens of caste division, which he utterly naturalizes and utterly thinks is the way to build things, right? I mean, that talk about categorization. I mean, that is your sort of earliest, ugliest version of categorization. And you'll see now why I am so resistant to categorization. So not only was it categorization with the British, which the British loved, categorization is much more of a Western trope than it is an Indic trope, but also a certain kind of sanctimoniousness in relation to sex. Now, mind you, the Manusmriti, even though it is sanctimonious, despite that and despite having been written almost 1,000 years before the British looked at it, or 2,000 years before the British looked at it, it is actually still more sexually sort of polymorphous than the British was. So, for instance, it recognizes male homosexuality, it recognizes female homosexuality, which even today most legal systems don't. And so there is a way in which the Manusmriti is also really fascinating, because it devises punishments for women who have sex with women, but devising a punishment means acknowledging that women have sex with women, which itself is really unusual. But of course, the British sidelined all that. And what they took from the Manusmriti was the caste distinction and a certain kind of narrative, which is why, to go back to what you were asking earlier about gay marriage, about people saying we are born this way, that rhetoric comes from the caste system. That rhetoric of saying you were born this way, that you cannot get out of this because this is your birth, this is your dharma, this is your fate. I find that argument chilling. And the reason I find it chilling is, I suspect, the same reason the British colonialists loved it, which is that now you can divide people and put them in certain categories and say, but this is your birth, this is your heritage, this is your history. You cannot, in fact, move out of these narrow confines. And so, yes, they found a lot that was sympathetic to their worldview in the Manusmriti. And yes, the Manusmriti was widely known and widely read, but not widely followed, and what's most important, not exclusively followed. It was never the go-to text or the single go-to text. It was always read in conjunction with other texts that tempered it a little bit, that sort of, shaved its edges off, its rougher edges off a little bit. But the British, by isolating it from everything around it, from all the discourses around it, really enhanced its perniciousness and made it even more horribly evil than it is.
Yeah, it's funny that the British, in the Section 377, don't actually mention homosexuality. It's unnatural acts. And your point seems to be that, all of us commit unnatural acts. Who defines what is natural? So it kind of affects all of us. And that's an interesting argument. But I think that it's not exactly fair to compare the, it's fair from a semantic perspective, but contextually, because the reason gay people say that we're born this way in the Western context, in the United States and Europe, is because there is such a thing called conversion therapy. Because if you don't say that, then you will be sent to these, if desires can change, then you'll be sent to these conversion camps where you'll be sort of trained to become heterosexual. So I think that argument came up because of the oppression that they were facing from the idea of conversion camps.
No, don't get me wrong. I am not at all underestimating the risks and the dangers and the horrors that are attendant upon being gay in the world, actually, especially ironically in the Western world. So I'm not for a moment underestimating that. What I am trying to push instead is an actual reading of the rhetoric by which we are oppressed. So yes, people might be oppressed by conversion camps, but the very idea of conversion is fascinating, because the very idea of conversion means if you can move from one thing to another, that means you can move from the second thing to a third as well. Or you can move back from the third to the first. And these people who are running the conversion camps don't think so, right? I mean, it's the same argument here with the BJP and the RSS and all, when saying anti-conversion. They don't mind converting back. They don't mind ghar wapsi. But that undermines the entire logic of their own investment in conversion. Because conversion insists that, in fact, people are not fixed. What the Hindu bigots and what the heterosexual bigots insist on is the same thing, which is that you are born in one way and you can never be something else, which is patently untrue. Because if you can't be anything else, then why would there be ghar wapsi? Why would there be conversion therapy? So if you're able to develop these discourses enough, if you're able to spend the time and energy into this rather than demanding gay marriage, you might actually have an entire substratum of arguments to fall back on. So we must never mistake our laziness for an inevitability. We must never mistake sort of the ease of joining the majority as the correctness of the majority itself, because it isn't.
So this was also one of the points that was raised when Andrew Sullivan, a gay conservative, he made the first argument for same-sex marriage in the United States. So gay and lesbian groups protested him, and they said that, by agreeing to this, by advocating for homosexual marriage, you're essentially conforming to the cisgendered heteronormative society. You're essentially asking the rights that they already have. So you're leaving out what is unique in homosexuality. Is that a point that you share as well?
Well, I'm not sure the word unique would be the one I would choose.
Yeah.
But I certainly think that there is a way in which wanting to join the ranks of the married is very much a catapultation to the ranks of normativity, to the idea of the normative. I completely agree with that. Again, this is not a judgment against people who might want to get married. I'm absolutely fine for anyone to want to get married. But the reason people want to get married is because it confers upon them this dhappa, this stamp of legal, social, political legitimacy. That's what I object to. And if people just want to have a party and spend all their money on it, I mean, I might think it's stupid, but that's entirely up to them. But I don't think just because you decide to spend all this money and be stupid, that the government should suddenly say, okay, yes, take all these rights from us. I don't think that's the government's prerogative.
So it seems like it's a form of enforced, because we have a form of enforced monogamy in most societies. And what you seem to be arguing for...
In what societies? Most societies.
Yes. What you seem to be arguing for in these 1.5 chapter is this opposition to two, right? The idea that only two defines love. Why not three? Why not polygamous societies as well? Why the right to be two? So this is a form of conforming to the status quo, and it's a very interesting idea, and it's an idea that only from your book I got to know that it has always existed in Indian society. You know, the idea of not being two, the idea of being half, the idea of being more than two, neither man nor woman.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. And, I'm wondering if you think that the opposition to female sexuality, same female lesbianism, because this is the love that cannot be named in its truest form, as shown by the example of the movie Date is Kya, where people have people have difficulty grasping the fact that two females can actually love each other. In India, we have the same for male homosexuals, but female, we don't, but for female homosexual, there doesn't seem to be a name. It's just not in our mind at all that this can happen. So why do you think that that's the case?
I mean, that's not exclusive to India. Almost all over the world, female homosexuality is not considered at all, legally or otherwise. And for the longest time, the understanding of sexuality was always penile penetration, which, since was thought not to happen between two women, what they did was not considered to be sex at all. So they didn't fit into the definition of sex, therefore they didn't fit into the definition of sexuality. And this was true around the world. In India, this idea does not extend only to women, it extends very much to men as well. I was just reminded when you asked this question, not just of Date Ishq Kiya, but that wonderful song from the film Khamoshi. I don't know whether you've seen it. That song that says, "Pyar ko pyar hi rehne do, koi naam na do. Humne dekhi hai, in aankhon ki mehkti khushboo." And the sense of we have a, not just we, I mean, I do think these strands exist around the world, but certainly in the Indic subcontinent, we have a very, very strong thrust towards not naming on the basis of the understanding that names restrict. And so this idea of, and this goes back to your question about religion and sexuality, the idea of a name restricts what might otherwise be a sublime experience. And by sublime, I mean not necessarily wonderful, but something that actually defies easy capture in the world of realism. And so if it defies easy capture in the world of realism, what are we doing by giving it a name? We're trying to make it comprehensible to ourselves. But the cost of making that comprehensible is that we start entering into these narrower and narrower agreements in which we agree to give over all our rights, all our sensibilities in favor of a very narrow normative notion of understanding the world.
How
Anwesh, you're frozen. Anwesh? Hi, Anwesh, you're back. You're muted, you're muted.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I was asking about language and gender, because you argue that Sanskrit is a gendered language, unlike contemporary English, which is relatively less gendered. So, there is an argument that linguists often make, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that language impacts your thought. So that if a language is, in this case, if a language is gendered, then your sort of worldview will be gendered and categorized. And that, I think, is the complete opposite of what is happening right here. So why do you think it's the case that a gendered language is able to sort of understand the limitation of categorization while a relatively less gendered language is strict and rigid?
Yeah. I mean, what is fascinating, or what I found fascinating when I was thinking about language and grammar, is that that direct correlation between language and gender did not exist, which surprised me because I also thought it would exist. And so, yes, for instance, Sanskrit is a deeply gendered language, but it makes room within its sort of masculine, feminine, neuter table to actually have different kinds of neuter. And so what becomes two becomes three, becomes four, becomes five. And there's sort of rapid proliferations, much like LGBTQIA plus ideas about gender and sexuality in a lot of Sanskrit texts. And if you look at the Kama Sutra, you'll certainly find that. Now, English actually is an ungendered language, which is very interesting. The only thing that it has gender for is pronouns. It has gendered pronouns. But does that mean that our ideas of desire are more free? In English, I don't think so. In fact, I think less so. So that is sort of an interesting contrast where there is no direct correlation between a language's gender and its attitude to gender. But if you look at languages like Persian, for instance, which is a completely ungendered language, no gender in the language, no gendered pronouns either. And then you see the vast, vast corpus of homoerotic poetry written in Persian. And then you think, oh, is there a correlation here between not doing gender in language and not doing gender in desire, such that you have a much, much sort of wider palette to roam in terms of your desire? Or even if you look at gendered languages like Urdu or Punjabi or Hindi, deeply gendered languages, except they don't have gendered pronouns. There is no he, she, or his, her in Urdu or Hindi or Punjabi. And in all these languages also, you've had huge numbers of Sufi poetry.
No, in other Indian languages too, like in Odia, there is no.
Yeah, sorry, Anwesh, I was just finishing my thought.
Yeah, I was just saying that in other languages too.
Anwesh. I said I was just finishing my thought, and then I'd like to hear you.
Yeah.
So I was just saying that, and so there is. I've forgotten now. You interrupted me twice, but I think I was trying to say that in these languages, there seems to be scope without gendered pronouns for actually thinking about the lover and the beloved, not in terms of gender, but in some other terms. And so the idea of a gendered language is not as straightforward as we might think it is, because gendered languages can sometimes not have gendered pronouns, and ungendered languages can sometimes have gendered pronouns.
So I was just saying that in other Indian languages too, there are no gender pronouns. In Odia, there are no gender pronouns.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts in general on gender pronouns? Because that seems to be the thing that has, so that's everywhere now. You have to, if you fill out a form, you have to talk about what your gender pronouns is. So that sort of forces you to be into a category.
Well, I've just written a piece about gendered pronouns. It is not out yet, but hopefully will be soon. I'm not a big fan of it, just as I'm not a fan of the acronym of LGBTQIA+, because again, I think of it as an extremely Western phenomenon. So when I have students who say, oh, my pronouns are he, his, or she, her, or whatever, I feel like asking, and what are the pronouns in the language you speak at home? Because it's such an Anglo-centric question. Because as you pointed out, and as I was pointing out earlier, most Indian languages do not have gendered pronouns. So now again, instead of inhabiting and thinking about the freedoms allowed to us without gendered pronouns, Why are we rushing to take on gendered pronouns in a language that we might speak in some parts of our lives? So again, this is not to say people should not announce whatever pronouns they'd like to be called by. I absolutely think everyone should have that right. And they should feel free to use it. All I'm saying is when we do that, we are forgetting the fact that English is only one of the many languages we might speak, and that there are other languages in which there might be other possibilities. And the scary thing for me about this kind of Western activist argument is that people just take it on board without thinking about it twice. Going back to your earlier question, without thinking about their location or their context, and they just take it on board wholesale. And that to me seems lazy. And it seems, again, something that needs to be rethought a little bit.
Also because it's done in the name of inclusivity, because we are being inclusive. That's why you need to define your gender pronouns, and we're going to respect your pronouns.
Yeah, doesn't make much sense, does it? Yeah.
Yeah. So also, the next question is on Sabarimala, and this is the thing that I'm most conflicted about, because I had a pretty black and white view of the issue before I read your work. My view was that it's simply a matter of rights. There is a sexist assumption that menstruating women are impure, or menstruating women are, as you point out, seen as seductress. But then when I read your book and the legends associated with it, I got to know that it's not as simple as that. There are certain elements of the Ayappan legend which are gender non-conformist. Ayappa is the son of the union of two male gods. He has an association with Paravar, which, although not explicitly homoerotic, can be seen through that lens because of his claim that, he's my sort of other half. So while there are progressive aspects of it, definitely, I do think I do have a hard time. I do have a hard time making sense of these contradictory aspects, because there is misogyny, clear misogyny, and then there is progressive. And what does it entail for us to do from a legal perspective? Because from a legal perspective, I would argue that women should be allowed to.
See, there's actually no conflict at all, Anwesh, and it's actually quite simple. The rule that menstruating women cannot enter through the front steps is entirely misogynistic and sexist and hateful and hideous. And the Supreme Court judgment saying women must be allowed to enter is absolutely the right thing to do, except of course they have backtracked on that already, which I find shameful, absolutely a blot on the name of the Supreme Court. So there's no conflict there. The law that women can't do this is entirely misogynistic and sexist. All those priests enforcing the law, all those people crying themselves hoarse are absolute misogynists and sexist. There is no conflict about it. What I am interested in is the basis of their misogyny, which actually does not exist. And so the Ayappan legends themselves do not lend themselves to misogyny. So when we are talking about misogyny in relation to Sabarimala, it is in relation to the so-called self-appointed keepers of Sabarimala. It is not to do with the myths around Ayappan or the legends around Ayappan or what we know about Ayappan. Because the myths around Ayappan, the legends around Ayappan, all point towards a starkly egalitarian God, not only in terms of sexuality, but in terms of religion. You have to pray at the shrine of this Muslim saint en route to Ayappan's shrine in Sabarimala, and also in relation to caste. It was one of the first temples in South India, and South Indian temples are horrible in regard to caste and religion. It was one of the first temples in South India to say anyone from any caste can enter this temple from the very, very beginning. So the ideals on which Ayappan stands are extremely egalitarian, are extremely, in fact, homoerotic, which is very interesting. the ends to which those legends have been put are misogynistic, sexist, self-serving, and hateful. So there's no contradiction at all. It's very, very clear-cut division. And so my line of thinking was, how are they basing their misogyny? And this has happened at different points in time across the world. How are they basing their misogyny on the same-sex desire that Ayyappan might seem to embody? And a lot of people say, oh, male homosexuality equals misogyny, which I do not agree with at all. And Ayyappan's legend is, I think, very clearly an indicator of the contrary, because rather than saying we hate women, all they're saying is, isn't it fun to hang out with men? And to me, that suggests a questioning of heteronormativity, not a vilification of women. But the self-appointed keepers of Ayyappan have made it their role in life to be hatefully misogynistic, and repeatedly so. And now with the approval, not just of the central government, but of the highest court in the land. I mean, it is a desperate and horrible situation.
So it seems to be a place where, men are supposed to roam freely without the fear of procreation or reproduction. So there is definitely a sense of homoeroticism there. But I was recently talking to a professor, an assistant professor at University of Madras. So she said that, why not do that for women? Like, why not ensure that a separate month where only women are allowed to go to the temple without the fear of procreation or the associated societal stigmas. So what do you think of that suggestion?
This is not something I'm saying Ayyappan says, that why don't men mingle without fear of procreation. That's not my argument at all, right? I don't know what Ayyappan said, and that's not what I'm saying. I am saying that male interaction cannot be upheld on the principle of heterosexuality, which depends in turn on a very strong principle of misogyny. The priests of the Ayyappan temple are able to assert their misogyny because they assert Ayyappan's heterosexuality, and because male-male interaction for them is an indicator of greater heterosexuality rather than less. That is their argument. My counter argument is simply how and where can you presume heterosexuality? That's it. I am not advocating 1 month for men, 1 month for women. I don't give a damn about any of that. My only question is, show me where the heterosexuality is, and then we can have a conversation. So that's my only question.
Yeah, well, it also ties in with many texts where it's not mentioned that there is a sort of homosexual or homoerotic relationship, but it's repeatedly implied. Sedgwick has made an interesting argument about Steinberg's of Mice and Men, where it's repeatedly implied that Lenny and George are actually couples because of their words, the way they speak, the way George is protective of Lenny, the way he says that, I want to give you soft things to cuddle because I want you to stay with me. Or their sad dream where they stay on a ranch together. So there is sort of an emphasis or implicit recognition of their of a kind of homoeroticism throughout the text, but it's rarely mentioned. It's not like there is no name for it. So I think in the case of this legend also, that is a possibility. I think that's what you're arguing for.
Sure, but again, I don't go there. As I said, my question is, where is the heterosexuality? Not here is the homosexuality, because I'm not that interested in that. I'm interested in how we make certain assumptions about people or certain assumptions about situations. And I simply don't see where this assumption is coming
from. Right. Well, interesting. So in your chapter on army, and this was the chapter that was a bit predictable for me because it's obvious to me. It's obvious because of public statements by the army that desire does sort of play a role in discipline and how they see desire being contradictory to discipline, unlike the Greeks who saw desire as a sort of binding factor. So the recent comment after the decriminalization of Section 377 was that we're not going to allow such things in the army because they interfere with discipline. So also there is what really fascinated me in that chapter was the your argument that women's bodies or women are sort of seen as fatal elements. So they are sort of being hospitalized when forced hospitalization of prostitutes and things like that because they're supposed to spread uh, disease and mortality. And it tied in with what my previous conversation with a social psychologist, Prof. Solomon, and he argues that the reason men are misogynist, or one of the reasons men are misogynist, is because women remind them of their mortality. Because women's bodies feel in them feelings of animality. They remind them that menstruation reminds them that there is reminds them of death because it reminds them that we are after all just animals and we're going to die. And he did this he proved this with an experiment where he was essentially a woman in a control in the group. There were men and women, and so the experimenter drops a tampon accidentally in front of the men, and when she drops a tampon, the men are more likely to rate her as not good and not professional, or they're going to be more rigid in their worldview than when there is a normal interaction. So do you think that this is a plausible hypothesis?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about it at all. I think one of the things that's more plausible for me is that women might remind men not of mortality, but of powerlessness or dependence. Because, of course, all men start out as fetuses in women's wombs and emerge from that and cannot, in fact, exist without the mother. And so we see a lot of misogyny and a lot of violence against women is always about asserting a certain kind of power or control over them. And I think it's related to a certain feeling of powerlessness or helplessness in relation primarily to the mother figure, to the female figure in one side.
Well, it's an interesting point. So, sex expert nowadays, so the sort of sex educationist, in order to destigmatize sexuality and destigmatize desire, they claim that sex is much more than just the act of intercourse. That it's not just about reproduction. It's about flirting. It's about conversation about boundaries. It's about foreplay and things like that. So do you think that there is an overlap in the definitions? Can you really separate sex from desire?
No, you can't, and that's what we were saying earlier as well. You can't separate it, but nor can you equate them and say that sex and desire are the same thing, because they're not. And so, as I said, desire sort of covers the ambit of sex as well, but is not reducible to it or containable by it.
All right. So I have a few questions that I got from a professor who is also a fan of yours, and I'm just going to read them out. She asks, as a student of English literature, your work in queer theory is fascinating. Sedgwick explains how binary of hetero and homosexuality is often premeditated by medical, legal, and psychological definition. So in Enlightenment Elizabethan period filled with religious violence between Catholic and Protestant, there were writers like Sidney and Spencer who remained very austere. How did Shakespeare and Marlowe and such writers use their art to push the boundaries of sexuality and desire in this context?
Yeah. I mean, I think all of them, Sydney and Spencer also really push the boundaries. I mean, Spencer, if you read The Fairy Queen, and you read all the sort of characters in The Fairy Queen, it's extremely raunchy and extremely sort of sexually explicit. I think all writers, to be understood as good writers, have to push the boundaries. And I'm not sure that the elevation of Shakespeare, exclusively is all that merited. So I don't know, in fact, if Shakespeare was great or if we have trained to thinking our ideas of greatness as being Shakespearean. But I think all of them, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, Sidney, all of them pushed the boundaries of what one can think. And that's what makes them such brilliant writers, is that they just sort of tease open the possibilities and the implications, which we can follow if we want. And this is why a writer is so, or a text is so uncaring at a certain level, right? It doesn't care what we do. It will give us the opportunity. And if we don't take that up, that's our problem. And that's what I find fascinating about texts.
Right. So another question is, Romila Thapar says that there are different versions of Sakuntalas in various texts. So the Mahabharata of Sakuntala is different from the Sakuntala that Kalidasa wrote about. And the same goes for Sita, Suppanakha, Ahalya, in the case of Kamba Ramayana, where these women were not portrayed as these demure, submissive women. Instead, they're portrayed as being assertive. So do you consider this shift from openness to being highly conservative as a cause of trade with other countries, or is it simply patriarchal conservativeness that has taken over our society?
The latter, for sure. Trade never leads to conservatism. Trade always opens up things, quite literally, which is why the trading communities around the world are among the most open communities. Even if you look at trading communities in India, the Marwadis in North India or the Chettiars in South India, they don't care what your religion is or what your caste is. If you want to trade with them, they'll trade with you. And so that leads to much more openness rather than closeness. I just want to point out that it's not only Ahalya and Sita and Draupadi and all these people who have different stories, it's the men also who have different stories. And this is what Ramanujan was saying about, 300 different kinds of Ramayanas. Rama is different in different versions. Ravana is different in different versions. But by sort of making one version hegemonic, which is, as I was saying earlier, the sort of gendered, conservative, gendered and sexualized Rama, yes, we are sort of catering to a very deeply patriarchal and misogynistic ideology.
So there are different versions of the characters in different societies. So like Ganesha in the north is often, Ganesha is often seen as brahmachari in a part of the society, while Kartikeya is often seen as brahmachari in the other part of India. So why do you think there is such a contrast between the stories behind these characters?
I'm not sure I know why there is a contrast, but I know that I'm delighted that there is a contrast. And it worries me when only one form is considered to be hegemonic and true. And that for me is the real problem, not the problem that there are multiple versions. I think the more the merrier, let a million flowers bloom.
Well, I completely agree with that, because I tend to lean a bit postmodern. So I think that there are multiple interpretations to one text. And so to pin down one text and this is the truth is, well, first, it's not the Indian way of looking at it. And second, it's exclusive. It's again about categorization and confines you to one area. So some would say that it's Abrahamic because of the rigidness that existing societies other than India. But I had an excellent time talking with you. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Anwesh.
I had an excellent time reading your book, and I would check out more of your work, and maybe we can do this sometime again. Did you enjoy the conversation?
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun. I'm sorry about the frequent thunderstorm interruptions of our Wi-Fi, but this was great fun. Thanks very much.
It was my pleasure.